The decolonization of Africa was one of the most significant events of the 20th century, reshaping the global political landscape. This process refers to the liberation of African nations from European colonial rule, which occurred primarily between the 1950s and 1980s. Decolonization not only ended colonial domination, but also had profound social, economic, and political impacts on the African continent and former colonial powers. Causes of African decolonization. The decolonization of Africa was driven by various internal and external factors that intertwined. Here are some of the main reasons behind this process. After World War II, 1939–1945, many European countries experienced severe economic and military devastation. Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, which were the main colonial powers, had to focus on domestic economic recovery. As a result, they found it increasingly difficult to maintain control over their African colonies. 2. Rise of African nationalism. World War II also accelerated the rise of nationalism in Africa. Many African soldiers who had fought as part of European colonial armies realized they were entitled to freedom and self-governance. Thinkers and nationalist leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya, Patrice Lumumba, Congo, and Julius Nyerere, Tanzania, began organizing resistance movements against colonial rule. 3. Support from the UN and international pressure. The United Nations, established in 1945, played a key role in promoting decolonization. The UN Charter explicitly stated the right of all nations to self-determination. Additionally, newly independent countries in Asia and Latin America provided diplomatic support for African independence movements. 4. Influence of the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States opposed European colonialism, albeit for different reasons. The Soviet Union supported independence movements to spread communist ideology, while the United States urged colonial powers to grant independence to prevent Soviet influence in Africa. 5. Local resistance and armed struggles. Independence movements in Africa were not only diplomatic, but also involved armed resistance. Examples include the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, the Algerian War of Independence, 1954–1962, against France, and armed struggles in Angola, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe that eventually led to their independence. The impact of African decolonization was complex and continues to be felt today in political, economic, and social aspects. 1. Political instability and internal conflicts. Many newly independent African countries faced political instability due to arbitrarily drawn colonial borders that ignored ethnic, cultural, or religious divisions. This led to ethnic conflicts and civil wars, such as the Nigerian Civil War, Biafra, the Rwandan Genocide, 1994, and the Sudanese Civil War, which resulted in South Sudan's independence in 2011. 2. Legacy of exploitative colonial economies. The colonial economic system, which was designed to exploit natural resources for European benefit, persisted after independence.
Many African countries remained dependent on exporting raw commodities such as oil, gold, coffee, and cocoa, without developing strong manufacturing industries. As a result, sustainable economic growth became difficult to achieve. 3. Neo-colonialism influence. Although African nations gained political independence, they remained dependent on former colonial powers for economic, military, and cultural matters. The term neo-colonialism refers to the phenomenon where former colonial rulers continued to control African economies and policies through foreign aid, investments, and trade agreements that were unfavorable to Africa. Emergence of authoritarian leadership. Many African leaders who replaced colonial administrations failed to establish stable democracies. Some became dictators or authoritarian rulers, such as Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Idi Amin in Uganda, and Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe.
These regimes were often supported by major powers during the Cold War. 5. Rise of Pan-Africanism and regionalism. In response to post-colonial challenges, many African nations began seeking collective solutions through regional and continental cooperation. The Organization of African Unity, OAU, later transformed into the African Union, AU, was established to strengthen African solidarity. Additionally, economic blocs such as ECOWAS in West Africa and SADC in Southern Africa aim to enhance economic cooperation among member states. The decolonization of Africa was a complex and challenging process. While it brought political freedom, many African countries still struggle with economic issues, internal conflicts, and neo-colonial influence. However, in recent decades, several African nations have made progress in economic development and democratization. Addressing the remaining challenges requires cooperation among African countries and the international community to ensure a more prosperous and stable future for the continent. By understanding the history of African decolonization in depth, we can better grasp the dynamics of global politics and economics today and how colonial legacies continue to affect life in Africa.